Dred Scott versus Sandford is one of the most infamous cases in American history. In it, the United States Supreme Court denied citizenship to millions of Black Americans and abolished a federal law allowing some states to outlaw slavery. This decision arguably contributed to the outbreak of the Civil War just a few years later. Dred Scott was a slave owned by an Army doctor named Emerson who lived in Missouri. In 1834, Emerson was sent to Illinois, a free state, and he took Scott with him. Emerson later took Scott to Fort Snelling in modern Minnesota, a free territory. In 1838, Emerson, Scott, and Scott's enslaved family returned to Missouri. When Emerson died, Scott sued Emerson's widow for his freedom in Missouri State Court after she refused to allow Scott to purchase his freedom. Scott's argument was based on the Missouri Compromise Act. The act was a federal law that had outlawed slavery in Illinois and the Fort Snelling territory. Scott argued that when he and his family were taken to those areas, they became free and could not be legally re-enslaved when they later returned to Missouri. The Missouri State Supreme Court ultimately ruled that Scott was still a slave. Ownership of Scott and his family subsequently passed to a man named John Sanford. For a second time, Scott sued for his family's freedom, this time in federal court. Applying Missouri law, the Federal Circuit Court concluded Scott was still a slave. The United States Supreme Court agreed to hear Scott's case to address two important questions. One, were slaves and their descendants citizens under the Constitution? And two, was the Missouri Compromise Act constitutional? Chief Justice Taney, writing for the majority, decided that slaves were not United States citizens and that the Missouri Compromise Act was unconstitutional. First, Taney reasoned that the Constitution's drafters didn't intend to include Black people in the term citizen, and certainly not Black slaves. By giving states the continued right to engage in slavery, the Constitution expressly singled out Black people as separate and apart from United States citizens. Regardless of whether attitudes had changed, the original meaning of the term citizen still applied. Further, no individual state has the authority to grant U.S. citizenship. Just because Illinois grants freedom to Black men and women does not mean they're citizens of any other state or the United States. Second, Taney also rejected Scott's argument that the Missouri Compromise Act had set him and his family free when they entered Illinois or Fort Snelling. Taney found that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional because setting slaves free deprived the owners of their property rights over those slaves. And the Constitution specifically says the government can't just take private property. Because the act was unconstitutional, it couldn't free Scott. At the end of the day, Taney wasn't sure that even free Black people were citizens. But Taney was sure Black slaves were not citizens and that Scott was still a slave. Because Scott wasn't a citizen, he couldn't sue in federal court, and his case had to be dismissed. 6 justices voted with Chief Justice Taney. Each of them wrote separately, emphasizing or further explaining a portion of the majority opinion. Notably, Justice Campbell disagreed that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional when applied to territories that were not yet states. Only 2 justices, McLean and Curtis, dissented. Each argued that Scott was a United States citizen. Justice McLean wrote that Scott and all slaves were citizens by virtue of being born under the Constitution and subject to its laws. However, McLean also argued that the Missouri Compromise was constitutional as applied to territories. Residents of the territories didn't have the same constitutional rights as residents of states, and McLean believed the Missouri Compromise could constitutionally take private property away from territory residents by freeing slaves. In his dissent, Justice Curtis took issue with Taney's definition of citizen, pointing out that Article 2 of the Constitution refers to citizens, quote, at the time of the adoption of the Constitution, unquote. At that time, the term citizen would have included many people of African descent who were recognized as citizens in free states. Therefore, the Constitution's framers couldn't have thought that Black Americans could never be citizens. Dred Scott versus Sanford was overturned following the Civil War, but damaged the Supreme Court's reputation so greatly that future Chief Justice Evans Hughes famously referred to the Dred Scott decision as a, quote, self-inflicted wound, unquote.